Hello, CASW members. It is a lovely day here in Ottawa. We're doing a great webinar presentation, so welcome. We're very excited to have you joining us today. We have a very special guest, and I am so excited to dive right into this webinar. It's definitely a webinar that's close to my heart. But before I do that, and before I introduce Natalie and Citizens for Public Justice, I did want to just go through a few housekeeping notes for all of our members who maybe this is your first time, or maybe you need a little refresher on how our webinar platform works, because it is very fancy and very exciting, and I want to make sure you get the full experience. So like I said, before I introduce Natalie, I'll introduce myself quickly. I'm Alexandra Zanis. I'm the Social Policy and Communications Coordinator here at the Canadian Association of Social Workers. You can drop me a link anytime if you want to know more about continuing education, our social policy initiatives, advocacy, social justice, or you just want to say hi. I am always around and would love to hear from you. In terms of the webinar platform, you will have a couple different screens. What you'll notice at the bottom is that there's a bar full of widgets. Now, all of those widgets are completely customizable. You can make them bigger, you can make them smaller, you can minimize them, you can make our screen bigger, the slide bigger, whatever you'd like. There's also a certification. So if you watch 40 minutes of this webinar or more, you can make sure you get your certificate of attendance, which is great. One of the most amazing things about especially this webinar is how interactive it's going to be. So there's going to be some polls and some opportunities definitely for everyone to engage. However, I would strongly recommend we use the question and answer section for comments or questions throughout the entire presentation. So if you have any comments, any questions, please use the quick question and answer box at any time. Those notes that you write in the question and answer box are all private unless you would like for us to make it public. So just know that it is anonymous when you are asking your question. The question and answer box is also a place if you need any tech help. So we have a technician online. They are incredible. If you have any issues with sound or with video, if you need to refresh your page or something like that, you can also use the question and answer box for that, and our tech person will help you out. So with all of that kind of housekeeping notes being said, I'm so excited to welcome Natalie. Natalie Appleyard is the Socioeconomic Policy Analyst at Citizens for Public Justice. I had the amazing opportunity of working with Natalie in my previous role at Canada Without Poverty. We spent a lot of time analyzing the poverty reduction strategy, a lot of time looking at the different measurements of poverty, the Advisory Council on Poverty, pretty much anything and everything in terms of poverty reduction. So one of the amazing things about Citizens for Public Justice is they are an organization that is inspired by faith to act for justice. So what they seek to do is equip and mobilize communities and individuals across the country to advocate for just policies in the area of poverty, refugee rights, and ecological justice. So Natalie uses her background in education to help convene and share knowledge with a variety of stakeholders. She's also a member of the steering committee for Campaign 2000, which aims to end child poverty, and the Canadian Poverty Institute. We also work together on the Dignity for All campaign. So Natalie has an extensive amount of experience. She's going to be an incredible person to talk to when it comes to what is the poverty reduction strategy and what is it going to mean, especially for our clients as social workers. So with all that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Natalie. Natalie, welcome.
Thanks, Alexandra. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, pleasure to get to do this together again. And so I'll just get started. As you saw in the description, we're looking at connecting the Canadian Poverty Reduction Strategy with the field of social work today. So I tried to go back to the description that you were initially sent and tried to make sure that the content actually reflects that. So you heard a little bit about CPJ, who we are. So some folks might wonder a little bit about sort of what we mean by public justice. So what we mean by public justice in terms of Citizens for Public Justice is that we describe that as the political dimension of loving one's neighbor. So we are an organization that is faith-based, but we work with other faith-based groups and with non-faith-based groups. And rather than seeking sort of a faith-based agenda or Christian agenda, we seek the common good in what we see as public justice. So that's a little bit about who we are. As Alexandra mentioned, we work in the areas of poverty, climate justice, and refugee rights. And we look at those issues on the federal level. So we do policy research and analysis, and also mobilization and engagement across the country. So we have a small office in Ottawa, but we have members across the country and board members across the country. And so I invite you to check that out if you're interested in what you hear today. So to give you an idea of what's coming up in this webinar, I have a couple of guiding questions. So Alexandra mentioned that I have a background in education, so I used to teach. And so I've got a couple of guiding questions for our webinar today that we're going to look at. So the first one, oh, sorry, so my camera's flipping. Let's fix that. Okay, so the first question, just want to make sure that you're seeing the slide that I am seeing. Alexandra, do you have this slide that says guiding questions?
I do. Yeah, I have the slide that says guiding questions.
Perfect. Okay. My little thumbnails are showing me a different slide, so I'm going to trust you on that one. Okay, so we're going to look at how does Canada's current poverty reduction strategy affect social workers and their clients, and what impact can social workers and their clients have on Canada's poverty reduction strategy moving forward. So we're going to take a look at some of these questions today, but since you've heard a little bit about me already, I'd like to know a little bit about you. So you'll see that there's a poll on your screen, and I'm just curious, what field of social work best describes your day-to-day? So if you can click on one of the options and hit submit, it's just interesting for us to get a sense of who's watching today, what area of social work that you do. So if everyone is able to do that poll. Okay, so I hope everyone's had a chance to do the poll. Okay, so let's see here. So we have a little over half of you are in direct support to clients on the front lines, a few in research or teaching, some in community development and advocacy, yay, policy, yay. Yay to all of you, really. You guys do awesome work. So just helpful for me to know, because I think that no matter what type of work you're doing in social work, that there is a connection for you to the poverty reduction strategy, and there's also an impact that you can have on what it looks like moving forward. So the poverty reduction strategy, there's a couple infographics here, and I know it's not going to be clear enough for you to read everything on there. It's more just for you to highlight for you that these infographics are out there. And so I'm going to direct you, I think the link is, I think you have the link somewhere, but there is a website for the Opportunity for All, which is the name of the Canada Poverty Reduction Strategy. So if you Google Opportunity for All, you're going to see some of the infographics that go over a little bit of the timeline, a bit of the process that was undertaken to create the poverty reduction strategy. But long before the government embarked on this project, CPJ and our partners at Canada Without Poverty, as Alexandra mentioned earlier, had a campaign called Dignity for All. And so for about 10 years, Dignity for All was calling for the creation of a national anti-poverty plan for Canada. So we had called for this. We've been calling for an end to eradicate poverty. We've been calling for poverty to be addressed according to human rights lens and across different ministerial sectors, so that we recognize that there's no silver bullet for solving poverty, that you have to take in different policy areas, different considerations. So the 6 areas that we had called for the plan to address were income security, housing and homelessness, health, food security, jobs and employment, and early childhood education and care. And I think probably right away there are some of those issues that jump out as some that you're probably coming in contact with in your day-to-day work as social workers. So for 10 years, Dignity for All have been calling for the creation of a national anti-poverty plan. And then in 2015, the government decided that they would actually embark on creating this strategy. So they had quite a significant consultation process. And so you can see a little bit about that in the infographic on the left in terms of the kind of consultations that they did with citizens and with experts. They received online submissions. And I will say actually that Dignity for All was responsible for 76% of the online submissions received. The government had created a website that people could fill out a form or include their comments in terms of their recommendations for what should be included in the strategy. And they weren't getting much pickup. And then Dignity for All created our own web portal and some suggestions for what people might want to recommend. So that ended up being 76% of those 1,100 email submissions. You'll see that number kind of beside the screen in the infographic on the left. So that was a significant impact that we and our supporters had the opportunity to make on the strategy. So just as the consultations before the strategy came out were a really important moment for engagement, consultations continue now that we have a strategy, and I'll talk a little bit more about that and how you can participate in those sort of consultations. So again, they've outlined a bit of the history of of how the poverty reduction strategy came to be on their website. I won't go into all the dates and timelines, but suffice to say that with the release of the strategy just over a year ago, a few of the key features are that we now have an official poverty line for Canada. We have certain targets to meet in terms of reducing poverty. They announced the creation of a National Advisory Council on Poverty, and they are measuring and tracking a number of measures to track their progress towards those goals. And also notably, there was some legislation passed that enshrined the goals and some aspects of the strategy in legislation, which is really important in terms of its longevity and how serious it is, and what sort of prioritization it gets in the budget. So they've outlined 3 pillars of the poverty reduction strategy, which are dignity, opportunity and inclusion, and resilience and security. So we're going to look a little bit at some of the programs that came up later in terms of the strategy, but that's kind of how they tried to conceptualize it. So there was a recognition from the beginning that when we talk about poverty, we're not just talking about material deprivation. We're not just talking about not having the things or your basic needs met, but that there's also an aspect of poverty that has to do with social exclusion, with your participation in society, and a host of other things. One thing that I will note that is important, I think, to mention in terms of the creation of the poverty reduction strategy is that there is a note on their website that they did apply what they call a GDA plus analysis. So there's just a little note that I'm going to read about how they did that. So it says that they've developed opportunity for all using a GBA plus lens in order to take into consideration the variation in experiences and barriers that different groups face related to poverty. Some of these groups include women, persons with disabilities, newcomers to Canada, single parents, unattached individuals, Indigenous peoples, transgendered and non-binary individuals, and individuals from Black and other racialized communities. So there's some acknowledgement that the experience of poverty ranges, considerably depending on these intersecting systems of oppression. So there are unique risk factors involved. There's different rates of uptake. There's all kinds of different considerations to be taken into account. So that's something that CPJ and DFA, we're pleased to see factored into the strategy. So as I mentioned, one of the key components of the poverty reduction strategy is that they came up with an official poverty line for Canada. So the measure that they used is something called the market basket measure. So the market basket measure is what we call an absolute measure of poverty. That means that it looks at a basket of goods and services that are deemed essential, and it says, okay, how much would that cost and it varies depending on region and whether it's an urban area or a rural area, how densely populated it is. So they factor in these different differences in the regional cost of living. And they look at sort of an average amount for these basic goods and services that are deemed essential. And then the question is, can you afford it or not? If you can't afford the basket, then you're considered to be low income or living in poverty. If you can't afford the basket, you're not. So that's what the market basket measure looks at and how it determines poverty. But there are some serious shortcomings with this measure. On one hand, you could say that it, at first glance, it seems like a rather humane measure. It's looking at, okay, well, do you have what you need? Can you afford what you need? And they included the costs of housing, clothing, food, transportation. There were some considerations made for childcare. But again, questions always remain about who is determining what is considered essential, what sort of expenditures are considered necessary to live a life of dignity and autonomy. And then also there's questions about the rates that were used. And unfortunately, a lot of the data that was used is quite outdated now. So the current measure that we started with is based on 2008 costs of living, which, as I'm sure you can all appreciate, has changed quite a bit. So they have undertaken an updated market basket measure, and it will be based on 2017 numbers. So that'll be a big improvement. But the other huge shortcoming that I want to say upfront about the market basket measure is that we currently don't have any numbers available for people living in the territories or for people living on reserve. And we know that those are areas where people are disproportionately living in low income and poverty. So I just want to point that out from the beginning. So anytime you see any government reports that are using the MBM, the official poverty line of Canada, just know that you have to read or hear that with a grain of salt, knowing that it doesn't include the numbers for people living in territories or on reserve. So again, the market basket measure is an absolute measure. It looks at the cost of goods and services, and so that's sort of looking at the material deprivation. But as I mentioned previously, poverty also has a lot to do with barriers to integration, barriers to full participation in society, a lot of social exclusion. So you'll just see on the graphic on the right that there's all kinds of other costs, other factors, other considerations that can't be captured by a material absolute measure alone. So the market basket measure was actually not the preferred measure of CPJ or Dignity for All or really any of the advocacy groups that I am aware of. and that goes to community level groups that are thinking like, well, the market basket measure is not really something that we can calculate ourselves. So if our services are dependent on where someone falls in the poverty line or sort of looking at relative levels of where people are in poverty, makes it a lot harder for them to determine where people are sort of on the scale. The alternative to the market basket measure, there are a couple, but one is something called the low income measure. And so we had called for the low income measure, which is a relative measure of poverty, to be used as the official poverty line. And on this next slide, it just shows, depending on the number that you use, the rates vary significantly. And this isn't just a matter of whether or not you're trying to downplay the amount of poverty somewhere. Any official line is necessary and is going to have drawbacks, but it's necessary to be able to measure your progress. So the MBM can still serve that purpose. But again, there are just some big gaps in terms of what it's actually capturing. If you look at the number at the bottom, so that big long initialization of the CF-LIM-AT, that stands for the Census Family Low Income Measure After Tax. So this is a number that's based on data that we gather when people file their taxes, and I'll talk about the importance of filing taxes later. So if you look at the low income measure, rather than an absolute measure of like, can you afford this or not, it looks at sort of average incomes. And then if you fall below 50% of the average income or the median income, I should say, rather, then you're considered. So not only does it capture whether or not people have enough income, but also looks at income inequality. So there's a strength to that, and we just have better data on it, frankly. So because we can use census data and tax filer data, which are much more representative geographically, then we're getting a better picture of what's actually happening in all areas. So the limit drawbacks as well. But no measure is perfect. We would have preferred this. Thankfully, it is still being tracked. So in fairness to the feds, I do want to say that multiple measures are needed and are going to be tracked so that we can see how we're doing. So again, if you just look at the numbers in Canada, whether you look at the market basket measure or you're looking at the limit, to me, really, any time that you're getting into the millions, the numbers start to be a little less meaningful in terms of 3.4 or 5.8. The fact that there are millions of people in Canada living in poverty is a huge problem, whichever measure you're using. And again, to recognize that as these are measures of income, that they also don't fully capture all the people who are struggling to get by. So even if we use a measure like the low income measure, that has a higher estimate in terms of the number of people living in poverty by income, we know that that also doesn't capture the number of people that are suffering with food security in Canada, for example, or with housing insecurity. So again, we need more than just measures of income to get a real picture of what's happening. So one way just to kind of visualize some of these numbers, Alexandra found this neat project that's happening in Toronto. And some folks have come up with a way to visualize the number of people in Toronto that are in need of housing. So this looks at if we were to create a tower that had enough units to house everyone in Toronto that was in core housing need, this is how big it would be. So there's a link that you can check out about this, but I think, again, sometimes those numbers in the millions can feel a bit abstract. But if you look at this tower, which is 3 times the size of the CN Tower and has a much larger footprint, that's what would be needed to house all the people that currently live in Toronto. So housing insecurity is one of the other really important measures for us to consider. Again, I know that these numbers, these images are going to be too small for you to see, but what I want to point out here is that in an effort to track multiple measures, you can visit a website that the Government of Canada has created in conjunction with StatsCan called the Dimensions of Poverty Hub. So you can just Google that in and you'll find that. So it breaks down, again, the 3 pillars of the poverty reduction strategy being dignity, opportunity, inclusion, and resilience and security. And then you can see some specific measures for each of those categories. So you can look at things like food security, you can look at things like housing security, access to healthcare. So there's multiple different measures that you can check out. So it's really encouraging to see that there's some recognition of these of this much more multifaceted nature of poverty. And the other thing that I didn't include in the slides, but I'll point you towards, is a project out that we did at Dignity for All called Living in the Gap. And what you can see there are a series of 6 infographics, and they're all fictitious case studies based on an individual or families in Canada in different regions. And so, again, the people characterized in that project in the infographics are fictitious, but the data is real. So we used real cost of living, real examples of people's stories and the sort of situations that they're in, and again, from all the specific cities or areas in which they're located. And we can see that in Nunavut, for example, in a Kelly, we had a family that we looked at, a case study that was $40,000 above the poverty line using the low income measure, but still was over $350 short every month in terms of the cost of housing, cost of food, cost of clothing, transportation, all these things. So again, just to point out that while the measures of income are really valuable for us to be able to track our progress and have a part of the picture, they don't give the full context of what people are actually living. So that's why it's important to have so many multiple measures. And it's also why it's so important to have the voices of people with lived experience of poverty at the table and participating in the consultations. And likewise, the people that work alongside them, which certainly include social workers. So if we were to base our picture of poverty in Canada on income alone, we'd have a very different portrait than what we get when we actually listen to people who are living it and who are seeing it in their day-to-day work. So again, we're encouraged to see lots of different measures, but recognize that each of them is limited in their own way. So I have another little poll for you, and again, looking at sort of this multifaceted nature of poverty that people are experiencing and how these different measures kind of each capture different aspects of that. I'm curious to know what needed goods or services would you say most preoccupy the clients you serve? So whether that's in your direct service or whether it's people that are represented by the kind of policy work that you do or the teaching or advocacy that you focus on. Just curious which of these areas that we do sort of have specific programs to address or specific numbers to address. Which ones would you say are at the top of mind for people that you work with? So I'm going to assume that people have had a chance to click. Maybe on multiple ones. Can you click multiple ones, Alexandra?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I wasn't sure of that. I didn't want to force you to choose just one.
No, yeah, you can pick a couple.
Okay, good. So, because we know that people don't only care about their healthcare. They don't only care about housing. So let's see. All right. So
wow.
This is really reflective of what we've been hearing. And yet I just want to point out that, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I think it's notable that jobs and employment is like the lowest bar of all of these. And again, it's not that we don't care about jobs and employment. It's one of the key policy areas that we feel needs to be addressed in terms of tackling poverty. But this myth that if people would just get a job, it would solve poverty is just patently false when you have a precarious labor market, low wage jobs, no benefits, so we certainly recognize the importance and the desire of people to participate in the labor market when they can, but we also recognize that many people legitimately cannot participate in the labor force, and many do, and yet still remain in poverty. So we know about the phenomenon of the working poor and how that is increasing, and how many people who are considered to be living in poverty or low income are actually working. So that's just notable.
I think this is a really good point, Natalie, because one of the main things is that, of course, as social workers, oftentimes one of our number one jobs is getting people into stability, and oftentimes that is jobs and employment. However, that's not necessarily the biggest need of individuals. One of the biggest needs might be housing. It might be food. It might be, being able to afford pharmacare and prescription medications. So giving someone a job doesn't address the housing crisis, or it doesn't address, our issues of social connection and healthcare. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's not that people don't want the jobs or don't want to work. For those who are able. But how can you maintain a stable job if you don't have secure housing, if you don't have enough to eat, if you are sick? So again, I think what we're seeing here is not so much like a lack of interest in jobs and employment or a lack of ambition in that regard, but it's just the simple fact that there are other needs that have to be precedence and or that have to be met concurrently, I should say. And not that we have to choose one or the other, but rather that we need to address all of these things for people to be able to participate in the labor market. And, so again, addressing housing needs and food insecurity and healthcare so that people can work, or addressing the shortcomings of our current social assistance program that, often really deter people from work because when they try to work, the wages are so low and the benefits are either non-existent or not enough that they actually can't afford to work. And so I think, again, these numbers to me really reflect a lot of what we've been hearing from people with lived experience and from the organizations that support them in terms of the kinds of services and policy priorities that need to be taken into consideration when we're tackling poverty. So thanks for doing that poll. And I think too the housing needs being really at the top of people's minds is really reflected in what we saw in terms of what the government did put out in terms of the poverty reduction strategy. And I know I haven't mentioned it specifically yet, but a key component of the poverty reduction strategy was the housing strategy, which is a distinct program, but is kind of seen as coming under the umbrella of the poverty reduction strategy. So I think really, across the gamut, whether people are low income or not, a lot of people are really feeling the squeeze of the financialization of the housing market. And so this is a really easy sell for a lot of politicians to embark on sort of addressing the housing crisis because everyone's feeling it. And so I think we see that reflected in the fact that the housing strategy, I would say, is a much stronger document than the poverty reduction strategy. That may be in part to the fact that it's a more specific focus, but the kinds of human rights framing, the types of budgetary commitments, the types of, or I should say the strengths at least of the mandate for the Housing Council and the Housing Advocate, they're all much stronger than the poverty reduction strategy in general. And I think part of that is, we're just seeing that if politicians know that so many constituents are really concerned about this issue, well, then that's where they're going to put their energy and their finances. That public will always precedes that political will. So if we are serious about an issue, and whether that's poverty or housing or any of these sort of sub-issues below, that public pressure has to come first, and it has to be maintained to make sure that things actually get done. And I think, likewise, we saw a food plan for Canada released around the same time. So, housing and food are the top two sort of preoccupations on this poll. And again, I think we see that reflected in the kinds of policies that get pushed forward. So what we've been calling for is not to neglect any one of these areas, but to make sure that they are all being addressed across different ministries, across different sectors, and at all levels of government. So what we've been calling for is a comprehensive, rights-based strategy that addresses all these concerns, because we know that when they're siloed, they affect one another. So if you don't have housing, it affects whether or not you can work. It affects your health. It affects your social connections. It affects whether or not you have money for food. So we know that these are all interconnected, as I'm sure you do too. So that's what we've been calling on the government to recognize in terms of the kind of strategies that are employed and the type of ambition that's employed across all ministries and all sectors. So just coming back to this idea of measuring poverty again, I'm showing you a graph that is from the government's website, from the Opportunity for All website. And it just highlights some of the particular groups and their different experiences of poverty in Canada. Again, these are NBN measures. So I've highlighted at the bottom that they that the numbers are currently not available for people living on reserve and for people living in the territories, which they are seeking to address, at least for the territories, and then they've committed to coming up with an equivalent or similar measure for people on reserve in collaboration with Indigenous groups. But if you look at these groups here, I always find that first column a little bit surprising, frankly. And I don't think it's necessarily sort of the dominant narrative about who is poor in Canada. So that first column of singles aged 45 to 64 is kind of an interesting group. And again, I think we just see that it's a group of people that are falling through the gaps in the sense they're not quite old enough to be collecting a senior's pension. They're unattached, so they're not eligible for the kinds of benefits that families with children would get. And many of them are employed in precarious work. Again, I should mention that a lot of these categories can overlap. So a single who's aged 45 to 64, who may also be an immigrant, or who may also be Indigenous, or who may also have a disability. Again, we have these intersecting levels of oppression and systemic discrimination in our society that we really, really need to start dealing with head on. So looking at the statistics again, so if Canada's average poverty rate at this time, and again, this was based on 2016 data, so for Canada it was 10.6, and then for singles aged 45 to 64, it's 3 times as high almost. That's pretty shocking. Again, we see, if you look at the column 16.8 for Indigenous peoples, that's only Indigenous peoples off reserve again. And the note at the bottom does acknowledge that the conditions on reserve and statistics on income, educational, employment outcomes suggest that poverty is much higher on reserve than off reserve. So again, we're just seeing these different levels of poverty depending on the groups that people belong to. And so again, one of the things that we've been calling for is for the application of an intersectional lens to recognize that, for example, for the lone parent families, the 29.2% of population that is low income, that are lone parent families, many of these families are led by a woman, and again will face different issues than if it's a male-headed household. Similarly, for recent immigrants, we can look at their educational background, we can look at their language abilities in either English or French. We can look at even just the country from which they immigrated. Makes a big difference. So even though we're starting to break down and disaggregate the data a little bit here, there's still a lot more information that we need to really get a picture of what's going on and to know where we need to start to target our support. So I'm curious of these groups, which of these groups you serve regularly in your work. So just curious whether you folks are seeing this kind of reflected in your practice as well. I'm just going to fix my camera. While you're filling that out, so again, we're looking for more disaggregated data. The government did introduce a new Center for Gender Diversity and Inclusion Statistics in Budget 2018, so that's a positive step. So there's some funding associated with that, some staffing, but again, all these things take time, they take training, and again, it just has to be a lens that has to be incorporated across different sectors, across different ministries. This shouldn't only be seen as the directive of the Minister of Child and Family Services, for example. So we want to make sure that all policy decisions are being evaluated in terms of their impact on these groups, and that they're disaggregating the data so that we know how people are being affected by different policy decisions, by different programs, who's using the programs, what kind of uptake are they getting by different groups. So let's take a look at who you are generally working with. Okay. So again, I know that the breadth of your experience and your work in the social work field is going to be huge. But again, just looking at this, nothing hugely jumps away from others except maybe the persons with disabilities. And again, there can be overall barriers there in terms of the nature of the disability, in terms of race, in terms of gender. And again, just to highlight again that many people's sort of pat response to poverty is to give everyone a job. Well, many people with disabilities, and certainly not all of them, but many people with disabilities aren't able to enter the labor force, or in order to enter the labor force, need those specific accommodations. And so there has to be funding attached to that. And again, it just has to be a lens that we apply to all our policy decisions to know how it's going to affect these different groups. So I know that there's not really an easy way for everyone to kind of share their reactions to things, but if you have questions about anything that you're seeing or hearing, please do share them. And in just a little second, we'll take a break to see if there are any questions. And so if you have any questions about anything that I've mentioned so far about the poverty reduction strategy or some of the numbers that you're seeing, just a reminder that you can send some questions in. So
I'm curious about the other category.
Oh.
I want to know what is other? I want people to type it in the box, because I'm curious, because the data doesn't have necessarily another category either. So I wonder if we're missing a category for the data as well. So if you clicked other, there was 25% of you. I'd love to hear what the groups that you work with. Yeah. Back to you, Natalie.
Okay. Yeah, we won't wait as you type slowly. Okay, so. Oh, okay. So yeah, if there are any other questions, now is a good time to ask them. Otherwise, we'll just keep moving forward. I'm conscious of time as well. So,
let's keep moving. One question.
Okay,
sorry, I had one question, Natalie. You use the term rights-based. Do you want to maybe get into what you mean by a rights-based approach to poverty?
Yeah, I'd love to. And it was going to come up in a little bit, but I'm happy to speak to that a little bit now. So when we advocate for a national anti-poverty plan, or when we look at these numbers about how many people are living in poverty, there's one part of us that might feel really sad and sympathetic and think oh, that's a shame. We should really be helping these people, and that is true, and that is good. But we also see, and I think that this, I'm just going to go back to this graph. The numbers also paint a picture that this isn't just about, some people falling on hard times, but this is about systemic injustice. And so when we talk about poverty and the need to eradicate poverty, we're looking at this from a rights-based perspective, because we believe that all people are created equal in its inherent dignity, and that they all have these inalienable rights. And poverty is a violation of some very basic rights. When we look at, again, I'm going to go back to this poll that we did about what some of the concerns are preoccupying your clients. Recently, we finally got in Canadian legislation an acknowledgement that housing is a human right. We know that there are basic rights to health care, that there are basic rights in terms of our dignity and opportunity, in terms of justice. And when we see these kinds of numbers, in terms of the disproportionate number of people, of Indigenous people, for example, who live in poverty, the disproportionate number of immigrants, there are other stats about just racialized people in general facing disproportionate rates of poverty. This points to a systemic issue. And so fighting poverty is no longer just about being charitable, but it's about seeking justice. And so we have referenced various international human rights covenants that Canada has signed on to, our own Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so there is a human rights, a legal framework that serves as a basis for action. and that suggests some ways in which people need to be accommodated, and our systems need to be changed to make it more equal for everyone and more equitable, I should say. So, for example, we looked at the statistics of persons living with disabilities, and we know that there are specific rights that people with disabilities hold in terms of the Accessibility Act, for example. So, and even just looking specifically at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is a good example, where we have these legal frameworks that outline what a just and equitable system would look like for people. And clearly, these numbers show that our system is not providing equal opportunities for everyone. So, so that's kind of what we get into when we talk about a rights-based perspective as opposed to a charity perspective. And it's also why we think that the government has such an important role to play, because this isn't just a matter of people kind of being more generous with their donations, giving more to the food bank, giving more to clothing drives, all of which are good things, and I don't mean to downplay those. I think that they are critical in terms of just interacting with people and treating people with dignity in a way that is compassionate, but they don't address the systemic issues that are causing the problems to begin with. So that's my little soapbox on sort of looking at poverty as charity versus justice.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, and something definitely to note is even, you're seeing a lot of food banks that are coming around and saying, food isn't going to solve food insecurity at this point. We need high-level systems change. So I wanted to say a couple of the other categories that it's funny to not even think about them. One was students, so that's interesting, elderly and seniors, and then women experiencing violence. So those are some interesting other categories.
Yeah, and again, I think when we see like the lone parent families, when we see Indigenous peoples, singles, you can see how a lot of folks in those groups would fall into these categories as well. The interesting note I will make about seniors is that we actually did see some significant decreases in poverty rates among seniors, and that's why they're not on this sort of worst of graph, if you will. So again, that just goes to show what difference can be made when there is targeted support to a specific population. So with improvements that were made in the poverty reduction strategy to the guaranteed income supplement and old age security, not just in terms of the amount of money that they receive, but that people were automatically enrolled in the program, that when they were filing their taxes, it wasn't like a special box that they had to check off anymore. So there are some, really simple policy decisions that can be made that have huge implications for whether or not these programs and services actually reach the people for whom they're intended. So just that note on seniors. And I will mention that there was specific mention in the housing strategy specifically about women fleeing domestic violence, especially, and that the housing benefit being something that could be tied to a person rather than an apartment or a house, for example, is just one of the ways that they're trying to address that. So, so that for someone who's fleeing an abusive relationship, for example, they don't lose their housing benefit if they're leaving that apartment because the benefit is meant to travel with them as a person. But certainly, a lot of the numbers that we see that are counts of homelessness underestimate the number of women and families that are couch surfing or just not represented in the numbers in terms of staying in traditional shelters, for example. So there has been, thankfully, some acknowledgement of the specific challenges facing people fleeing domestic abuse. And then for students, again, we tend to see some talk about changes to the cost of education. Some students might be eligible for things like the first time home buyers if they're more mature students. But again, I think also what we're seeing is that some students are being kind of cushioned from those costs because so many more students are living back home with family because they can't afford to live on their own. So we certainly see those groups again experiencing poverty in different ways and having different social supports to either build resiliency or to prevent them from falling into poverty in the first place. Okay, so let's move on now to social workers and the CPRS. So CPRS as it exists, it's not perfect. It's kind of just a list of some benefits and programs that either already existed or a few new ones that they rolled out or improved. Again, if you look at the Opportunity for All website, you can see a table that lists all of the different initiatives that they consider to be their key investments. So it includes things like the Canada Child Benefit, which was increased and indexed to inflation. It includes the supplements for seniors that I mentioned, the housing strategy, plans to create a separate Indigenous housing strategy, which we still haven't seen yet. They look at investments in early childhood education and care, for example, labor market transfer agreements with the provinces and territories, something called the Canada Workers Benefit, changes to employment insurance. So all these things are some programs and services that they are kind of describing as falling under the umbrella of the poverty reduction strategy. So when the strategy itself was released, our general response was it was really less of a strategy and more of like a best hits kind of list. And then, but with the important addition of the official poverty line being selected and some specific targets made. So that I think I neglected to say this. The actual target in the poverty reduction strategy was to reduce poverty in Canada by 50% by 2030. We don't feel that's adequate, and that comes back to our human rights framing. We don't believe that any amount of poverty in Canada is acceptable, and that our strategy should have an end goal of eradicating poverty. And yes, people are going to fall in hard times. People are going to have situations where they may not have what they need for a certain amount of time, but we should not be seeing the kind of chronic poverty that people are experiencing. We shouldn't see it on the scale that we're experiencing. And again, to address that, we need multiple wraparound programs and services to address all these different aspects of the challenges that people face that put them at risk. So again, with the CPRS being such as it is right now, what's the impact for you as social workers and for your clients? I think one of the biggest areas that social workers are probably going to see themselves interacting with the poverty reduction strategy and its sort of umbrella services and programs are in terms of education and program uptake. So for the clients that you serve, for example, many of them will need help sort of navigating these systems. I put tax filing on there because it's so critical, and I alluded to this earlier. Many of the benefits that are included under the poverty reduction strategy come in the form of a tax benefit. So if people aren't filing their taxes, they're not getting the kinds of benefits to which they're entitled. So that's a huge one, both in terms of helping people file their taxes and convincing them that they should. So that's a big one. Navigating the housing strategies, as I said, if you take a look at what's in the National Housing Strategy, there are some new programs coming up with some new benefits. The benefit that I mentioned in terms of, but the housing benefit that is going to be portable, that stays with the person rather than the place, is something that, a lot of times they'll make a list of things, but the programs actually don't start for a year or two. So it's just good to keep abreast of what's coming and make sure that we can help educate people about the programs and benefits to which they're entitled and help them to navigate the systems so that they actually receive them. And then the other is looking at employment insurance, and that is not just in terms of if someone has lost work, but it's also looking at things like parental leave and adoption leave. There have been some important changes to strengthen the support to people with young families. So again, I'm just flagging a few things for you in terms of some areas that I think overlap quite a bit. And then the other major piece, consultation and monitoring and advocacy kind of all go together. But as I mentioned, there are opportunities both before the creation of a strategy like this, but also during the rollout of the strategy and after the fact. So there are going to be cycles of evaluation, both of the measures of poverty, but also in terms of program evaluation. And so as social workers and as people that are kind of on the front lines or that are subject matter experts, both in terms of your research and your teaching, the government needs to hear from you. And if you have ideas for ways to bring the voices of the people that you serve directly to the government as well, that's just such an invaluable contribution. Because again, that's where the rubber meets the road. Are these programs, are these strategies actually meeting people where they're at? Are they actually accomplishing the goals that are set out for them? At CPJ, we try to mobilize citizens across the country in our campaigns. We try to encourage people to act locally, but as part of a national campaign so that they feel a connection to something bigger. I know it can feel frustrating when you're doing frontline work to feel like, you know, even as valuable as the work that you're doing is, it can be so frustrating and so exhausting to feel like there's just no end in sight, that it's not actually fixing the problem. And so I would encourage you to bring your stories, to bring your experiences to these opportunities for consultation and for monitoring, and to participate in some campaigns. So I'm just going to highlight a couple opportunities for you and encourage you to kind of connect if this is something that interests you. But the very first thing I would say is, to let your MP and any ministers related to your work know what you want and when you want it. And I always tell people, you don't have to be a policy expert to talk to your MP about what matters to you. And again, that public will is always going to precede the political will. So even if you're not telling them what they need to do about a problem, if you're letting them know that you think that poverty in Canada is a disgrace and that there are systemic injustices that we need to see rectified, that we're seeing systemic racism, colonization of Indigenous people and racialized people continues. If you let them know that you care about pharmacare, that you care about Medicare, that you care about housing, that you care about support for students, for seniors, let them know. Again, you don't have to have all the solutions. You just have to let them know that you care. And you have to let them know that you're watching to see what they're doing about it. And, you have a different weight than I do as someone who, we do go to the Hill, we do meet with MPs, we do meet with ministers. But it's different from me going as a paid employee doing that. And again, there's still an important role to play. And we try to bring the impact of our members across the country to bear. But you being able to go and share a personal story, a personal experience, that's going to be much more moving, especially for your local candidate, for them to know that this is a constituent in their riding that is going to demand an answer on this. So really quickly, I'm not going to go into all our specific recommendations just for sake of time, but Dignity for All has something called Chew on This. And the top left picture is a group of social work students, no less, from Memorial University in St. John's. And so this is our annual anti-poverty campaign where we call for a comprehensive human rights-based strategy to end poverty in Canada, not just reduce it. So you can go on the Dignity for All website and find out what we're asking for in terms of changes to the poverty reduction strategy, some recommendations that we've made for the poverty, for the advisory committee on poverty, some specific asks that we have about whether it's about the MBM. Again, there's kind of big wish list here, some programs that we've been calling for. Just transition, I'm just going to point out, when we talk about switching to a less carbon-intensive economy, we need to make sure that while we do care about oil and gas workers and make sure that there is a transition plan for them, that we also recognize that there are millions of people that have been left out already of the profits of that industry. And so when we're talking about a just transition to a green economy, that we also make sure that we're considering people who are already marginalized, people who haven't been benefiting economically so far. So again, big wish list here. I'm conscious it's 2 o'clock, so I'm going to pause there and turn it over to you, Alexandra.
Thanks, Natalie. That was awesome. So yeah, it is 2 p.m., so we are done for our allotted time. I have a couple of questions about the certificate, so we are going to look into that. I'm not exactly sure what's going on. I think that there may not be a certificate loaded into the doc that's saved. So please just send me an email if you need your certificate, or else once this webcast is done, you can log back in and there should be a certificate up there for you. So fingers crossed that should be fine. We've talked with our tech, but you might just need to log back in. So we don't actually have any questions right now that we weren't able to get through. So I think with that, I will just say thank you so much, Natalie. We really, really appreciated this. I think we'll probably have to do a separate webinar on the housing strategy and everything else.
There's a lot.
There's a lot. Yeah, there's
and
a lot.
Not enough.
Exactly, right? So yeah, so thank you so much. This was so beneficial. I can't believe how much now I know about the market basket measure and about the official poverty line, and especially about filing taxes and all those really great little tidbits. So thank you again. And to all of our members, thank you so much for signing on and participating today and participating in the polls and asking your incredible questions. We hope to see you soon in our next webcast. So thanks again, Natalie.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone who watched.
Bye.